There we go. Okay. Welcome, welcome. Jane, when do you want your time for the...
Oh, we can just do it right now if you want, just to, I mean, it's only like 30 seconds.
Okay. Um, let's do it. I will spotlight you.
Am I going to share screen?
Hopefully.
Yes, there we go.
Yay!
Okay, this was just a little thing I thought of last time we did this when we were writing. And as I thought about the loops, these big loops after, let me find a pencil. After the fact, I thought, to break it down, because I know we said go 2 or 3 X heights above and 2 or 3 X heights below. But when I really thought about it, I thought, okay, let's do it this way. So here you can see, let me just zoom in a little. So here's our X height, and this is 1/4 of an inch. And then I just marked down 3 X heights and 2 wide and made the grid. And then as I come down, when I'm almost to that bottom one, you go over to about the middle and then go over to about here and then back up again. And that made sure that I get that nice counter space in here to get the loops the way Gwen Weaver does them. And it's the same going up the other way. So if your H is like here, you're going to go up, around, and that's too pointy, and then come back down. And so it's F and H that go up. But when I broke it down into the squares, it made it easier for me to think about how wide and how tall they need to be. So I just thought I would pass that along for any of you who might be struggling with the loops on that hand. And that's all.
Thanks,
you,
Jane. Okay. Here we go. So when Janice asked me to teach, she said something Michael Keksig. So that's what you're gonna get. And I want to show you some Michael Keksig first. So in the Speedball book, the most recent one, there's the fold out of the Chicago fire. That is Michael Keksig. I couldn't find my Speedball book this morning, sorry. But I did find these, which let's focus.
How do you spell his last name?
Oh, Kecseg. And if you decide you like this, then he hasn't been traveling to teach in years, but he does teach online sometimes. So I've taken 2 online classes from him now, and he is delightful and does wonderful things with a pen, and also pushes you to do wonderful things with a pen. And he has the dirtiest, goopiest ink, stick ink stone I've ever seen, and that gives me hope because I'm kind of like that as well. So this is from one of those engagement calendars, 1992. You'll see them in the flea market periodically. Pick them up because there's great inspiration in these. You'll notice that he has a great touch with these extended lines, and his curves are very graceful. He also, which is pretty specific to him, has this downstroke and bounce that he does with a pointed pen. You'll see it a lot in brush lettering and not as often in pointed pen, but he does it in pointed pen. And he varies it. So here's a down and bounce, here's a down and loop up. He also has an amazing touch with these finials, like the end of the stroke, and the beginning of the stroke. He makes them do what he wants them to do. If he wants them to be chiseled, they are chiseled, and he gets them to do that. And he's not necessarily a slow, meticulous letterer. He's careful, but he is very driven by rhythm. Here is another example. Oh, I'm going to wipe. I wonder if there's something on my lens. So just a second, sorry. Is that going to make it better? I don't know. He, in one of the workshops that I took with him, we did lettering on black as one of the steps. This is a style of lettering that he calls pointed pen black letter. So he took the ideas of black letter or Gothic broad edge lettering and tried to figure out how he could use those characteristics with a pointed pen. And the finial, the beginning and the ends, he's very meticulous about those. These are squared, but they're at a slant, and that gives the whole line, the downstroke line, an interesting life and livelihood to it. And his connectors are a nice strong end and a jump. Then there's one more. This is another one. Again with the black and white, changing the background. And this is lettered and then a single line, like a shadow line. But he also does a beautiful lettering style that he calls a double stroke. And it's like this, but he uses thick and thin strokes for these shaded lines. So those are 3 examples from Mike Hexig. And now we will play. So what the first one, if you like this, the class is Contemporary Styles, I think he calls it, with pointed pen. You'll need a pointed pen, and I said use a nib that you like. I'm using the Gillette 303 because I like this nib, It gives me finer fines. It's more reactive to pressure than a Zebra or a Nico. And I have more control with it. And a pen holder that you like, I'm using, this is a yoke handmade pen holder. I think it's pear wood, and it's the perfect size for my hands, and I like it the best. And sometimes with oblique pen holders, I feel like this thing, there's a real name for it, I can't remember it right now, it gets in the way of my thumb, but it doesn't on this pen holder, so I like it. This is a Hunt 101 in the dual pen holder, where you can pop this oblique holder out and it could be a straight pen holder as well. I won't use it today, but whatever you like, that's what you should use. And then whatever ink you like, that's what you should use. The thing with oblique pen holders is you can't always dip them in every jar. So the way to get over that is to use a brush to dip into your fluid and fill your nib, or transfer your fluid into a jar that you can dip in. So today I'm going to use Bister ink that I mixed. It's on the more crystals to water ratio right now than so it's thicker, and I'm gonna dip. And when you dip, you want to avoid dipping all the way to your flange. You just need to cover your vent hole. And then what I want you to do is make the thinnest line possible. There are a few hints to help you do that. To make the thinnest line possible, you want your shaft, your pen shaft, running up your finger instead of in by your thumb. So it's running up your finger and not your thumb, so that only the tip of your nib touches the paper and we don't do any pressure. So make 3, let's make 6 as thin as possible lines. Then we're going to mirror image curve the lines. So thin as possible, but we're going to start like we have a circle here, and we're going to go out, curved, 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 and then mirror image curve as thin as possible. And you might have to try that one a couple times. The next time you try it, try doing the long curves first and mirror image those, and then work away from those and see if that helps a little bit. Now we're going to repeat these, but this time we're going to make thick lines and we want them to be consistently thick. So no thin to thick, just a consistently thick line. And I want you to pay attention to how you start the line. So I'm going to place my nib, push some pressure, and pull, and then stop and snap it shut. Place my nib, spread, pull, I ran out of ink, and snap it shut. Place my nib, snap it shut. Your paper matters. The interaction between the ink and the paper will be different. It's like photography where you have the shutter speed and the width of the opening and the light. So I'm using HP Premium. It's very smooth. It's a little bit thicker, and most inks work really well on it. And I don't have trouble with feathering usually. So the next thing is thick but curved. So thick and curve. And you'll notice that it's harder to get a chiseled square end at the end of the curve. So work with that. You can make a point. Right now we're finding out what the tool can do. We are going to do a thin to a thick. When I add pressure to a pointed pen, it happens with my index finger. I don't change how I'm holding it with my thumb or my middle finger. I simply push on the pen with my index finger, and that puts enough pressure on my nib to spread it. So I'm going to start out thin and gently add more pressure to get to a thick, and I'm going to push it to see how far thick I can go, and I'm going to snap it shut. So start thin and gradually add pressure and snap it shut. What we're trying to avoid is a thin and a shoulder. That is something you do when you want to, but right now we're trying to get a gradual build to the thickness of our pen. Now we're going to do that in this curve system. So thin to thick in a curve. Thin, whoop, thin to thick. I don't know if I can do it. I'm gonna have to noodle it. And in order to make it look curved, I don't know why this isn't focusing well. That's driving me crazy. To make it look curved, my finial is going to be at an angle instead of a squared thing. So thin, gradual to thick, and my finial. Thin, gradual to thick. And I need to do the other side. You'll find that one direction is probably easier for you than the other direction. Take note of that and then turn your paper when you have to do something in the direction that's hard for you. Now we're going to do the opposite. We're going to start thick and then gradually go to thin. So start thick and release the pressure and go to a thin. And your goal is no shoulders, no jumps, gradual transitions. And when I start thick, my thins never get as thin as when I start thin. That's something I need to know about myself and practice so that I can work on changing that. Okay, we're gonna do the fan now, thick to thin. And I start with the longest one first because that's going to be more successful for me. And so this curve to the right is easier for me. These are more successful. So if I know that about myself, I will probably turn the page when I have to make a curve to the left and figure out a way to do it where my hand is happier. The next stroke will be a slanted beginning. And there are several ways to do this. If you're great with a pen, you can do it with just the tines of the nibs. I'm not there yet. So I'm going to give myself a little teeny mark of the slant, and then I'm going to fill that in, thin back to thick, so that my beginning of the line, where's my red one? My beginning of the line is this way, and the end of my line is that way. So the cheater way, which isn't really cheating if it makes it work for you, is to make a little teeny line, a dam for the ink. And I'm releasing pressure and then adding pressure back. And then as I'm ending, I'm pulling the nib as I'm allowing it to close slightly to the right. And I will try it without cheating. So I'm going to start out thin and push while I open it to the left. Whoop, I ran out of ink. Start out thin, push. Sorry. Start with just the point. Push to the left and open. Release pressure, add pressure, and pull to the right as I close it. And that gives you a sense of a curved line, but it happens with the thick and the thin of the line. So let's do it with this fan. I'm going to start with my longest line first. Pretty happy with that. And then a shorter one. Not so successful. And then the shortest one. And on the left side, I'm going to keep the same curve going because the next round we're going to change the curve. So slanted to the left. So this was what we had just done, where the angles were this way. So we're going to reverse that angle. And this might take you a couple tries because we don't usually do letters like this, but our pen is capable of doing it, and we're trying to push the pen. So we're going to start, we want our angle, entry angle, to be this way. So I'm going to start and enter and exit. And if we do it in a fan, I'm going to start with my longest stroke first because that helps me be more successful. And I'll work away from that. Whenever you need to touch up something, it's best to do it while the ink is still wet, so you can just pull the existing ink into the space that you want to touch up, or you have to wait till it's completely dry. And then you have trouble of matching color and but you could scrape. Now we're going to do the opposite of this, where it was thick to thin to thick. We are going to do thin to pressure to thin, and we have a slight curve to it. And this one, we can do our fan right away. And if we do a thin to thick to thin, let's do a thin to thick to thin, but with an S curve to it. So the longest stroke will look thin to thick to thin, like that. And if we do our fan, and let's mirror image this one. Thin to thick to thin, thin to thick to thin. If you do a lot of ornamental penmanship, this is already something that you're familiar with. But what we're doing is we're finding out what our pen can do. So now let's draw some horizontal lines. And if we hold the paper the way we've been holding it, and the pen the way we've been holding it, if we draw a horizontal line with an S curve and we add some thicknesses, the thick will be on the verticals, right? Because if we tried to do thick and pull the pen here, we wouldn't move. So a thick to a thin to a thick. So that's if we don't change our paper, don't change our pen, the thicks will be on these vertical axis and the thin will be on the horizontal.
Hey, Brecken,
Yeah.
sorry to go back, but will you please draw the beginning and ending angles for the second group that you've done?
The second group,
I think it was the thick to thin to thick. How
these.
the angles.
Okay. So
Okay.
the first group looks like this. So the angle is here and here. And the second group is the opposite of that. So, whoop. Let's try it again. And so that is this.
Yeah, that helps. Thank you, Brecken.
If you're using ink that is water fast, specifically Sumi ink, you will want to periodically clean off your nib, because the ink will dry on your nib, and then it changes how pointy your point is and how much ink your vent can hold. So be aware that that is something you will want to do. Okay. Now, this one, we started here and we went that way. So we're going to do another horizontal line, but we're going to start here and go this way. So because we're not changing our paper or our pen, the thicks will be on the vertical part. So thin to thick, horizontal to thick. You will find one of these directions is easier for you. And then once you know which one it is, you have permission to stick with your strengths. So the purpose of this is to find out what the pen can do. Can you move it? Can you create that line with this pen? I'm having troubles that way. Then we have one more experiment, and this one we want a horizontal stroke, but we want the thick in the horizontal. In order to get that, we have to turn our page because of the mechanics of the pen. So to get a horizontal stroke with a thin to thick to thin, we have to turn the page. And I find that I turn the page so that my wet stuff is away from my hand. But sometimes you will need to make a stroke that requires you to turn it so the wet stuff is on under your hand. And that is the pits. So you usually have to wait until it's dry to add those strokes. So all of these strokes happened with one little pen. And now we're going to use what we know about our pen to mimic some lettering. So you can put your pen down for a minute, and I'm going to demo first and then give you time to do it. the first two, well, the first four were fonts that Mike included in his class. So the first four fonts are the ones that Mike suggested to try this with first. And then the next, the portrait style ones, these are fonts by respected type designers who either are adored by calligraphers or were also a calligrapher. So those are for your perusing. So in order to look at a lettering style, we're using a font right now, we need to analyze it. And in order to analyze it, we need to give it some vocabulary that we as calligraphers are used to. So the first thing we are going to do is find the baseline. So if you want to just take notes on this part, you can, because you'll have time to work on this. Some fonts you'll find, or lettering that you're analyzing, have a interesting relationship with the baseline where they won't always touch. But it looks like that's the baseline, but this K isn't touching. But most of my letters are touching. And because this is a font, and because I know that my printer's pretty well aligned, I can cheat and make sure my ruler is square on the edge of the paper. So I'm going to give myself a baseline. Then, because I already did the math for this, and I know that I printed this font so it would be pretty darn close to a 1/4 inch X height, I could either use my ruler to mark the X height, but once I have the baseline, I don't move my ruler, and I use my trusty what is Ames lettering guide to do my X height. And I will just kind of lightly check to make sure. And looks like the X height is a little bit taller than a 1/4 inch. So I'm just gonna nudge that up a little bit. And I'm gonna do a darker line. So I have my baseline and my X height for this letter. And but what about this K? That goes above. And this J, what about that? That's part of the quirk of the lettering style. And so when I am using this as a thing, I will take that into account, and I can decide to change it or keep it the same. So baseline, X height. And I will do that for the next one. If you want to do the baseline and the X height, you can do that right now. And then we will talk about the next thing we have to mark. So I'm checking most of them. If there's an outlier, I'm gonna let it live. I'm not gonna try and change for the outlier. One thing you could do if you know you're going to be working on a grid pad is also give yourself the 1/8 inch square line. I do it in a different color so that I don't confuse myself. These are mechanical colored pencils. They are Pilot Color ENO, and they were recommended to me by Gemma Black when I was taking the Killian class from her, and they work great on black, and they are also nice and sharp. And then you can do all of this and you can have color codes instead of just a bunch of pencil lines. So I have a baseline, an X height, and I have this midline. What I should have done was the midline before I moved my ruler up there. Now I will make a note to myself that the X height is 1/4 inch. And now what I need to do is the descenders and ascenders. So I'm going to line up my ruler. I'm checking against the edge of the paper, and I'm looking for generally, and I'm going to give myself a different color because I think visually. So that's my descender line. And now I need to find my ascender line. And it looks like, well, I see how I have a teeny bit amount of white space above my ascenders. I'm going to redo that just because I want a better idea of what's going on here. Okay. So it appears my ascenders are taller than my descenders, right? And with a see-through ruler, I can't find mine, you'd be able to tell for sure if they are. But it looks like this, it's a descender, it looks like it's about 1/8. And the ascenders are like 1/8.5. It's almost 1/4 inch. So, but I'm gonna write 1/8 plus. So I have my X height, I have my ascender and my descender. Now we need to determine slant. And just looking at it, it doesn't look very slanted, does it? The way I do this is I go to the longest strokes I can find, and I line my ruler up with that stroke, and I mark it so I can kind of see what's going on here. And this F, it looks like it's slant and then curves out a bit. So I'm gonna try and split the difference, keep my ruler on the majority of that straight line. And this L is a loop. So for a loop, for the F, I ignored the loop. I put it right on this downstroke. But this L, it looks loopy to me. So I'm not gonna have a straight line. So maybe I'll bisect the loop and see if that gives me a slant. So there's a little teeny bit of a slant to these letters. And they're pretty consistent. So when it's this small of a slant, when I start lettering these letters, I know that my letters tend to slant to the right. So I'm just going to tell myself to do a straight letter instead of a slant. And I will probably end up hitting this little teeny bit of a slant. Now my next question is, are there thicks and thins in the letters? And where are they, and how am I going to make my pen do that? So the first letter I'm going to look at is the O. The O will tell us several things. It'll tell us the shape, the main shape of the letter is this oval. And it looks like if I started my pen at the top and had a little bit of pressure, release the pressure, and had my either an upstroke to make it very thin or a downstroke with no pressure. So the thick is on the right, or on the left, and the thin is on the right. That's pretty normal for letter shapes. The P will give us a branch and an oval. So a thick downstroke, a thin branch, a thickness here, but look how it gradually goes to a thin above and right below the egg's height. It's not thin up, thick down. It's thin to gradual to thin again. So I have an oval, and usually I would go to an N next to figure out what the branches look like. But look at that N. I have a downstroke, and then all the way at the baseline, I have a thin coming up and a thick coming down. So now I need to compare it. Is this the way it's going to branch all the time? The B, yes. The D doesn't do it. The D has more of a traditional branch. The H, yes. The K, yes. The M, even on this guy, it's down and the branch comes all the way from the baseline. So these downstroke and then a branches are going to come from the baseline, but the branches on the D family, the D and the Y, are going to close that gap, and the Q and the P. So I'm making these mental notes to myself while I'm doing it. And then I'm going to look at the font in how it flows, and are there connector strokes? Do the letters pretend to touch each other? Is it like a faux script or cursive? And these don't, but they do have an exit stroke. So now what we're gonna do is, on your grid paper, we're gonna take what we learned and from analyzing the lettering, and we're gonna do it ourselves with our pen. So what I need to do is, my X height is 1/4 of an inch. My ascender, remember it was an 1/8 plus, so I'm just going to give myself that clue. And my descender was an 1/8. And looking at this, I can tell that my letters are tall and narrow, right? They're not quite as wide. So if I line one of the lines up with the stem, it looks like it's 1/8 of an inch wide, while it's 2/8 tall. So on the B violates the 1/8 just barely. But generally, these letters are going to be 1 part wide to 2 parts tall. Except for the F. The F is narrow. So what I would do is I would start with the simplest letter, and that's a letter I. So my I floats a little bit. It has a gentle curve. There's a slight slant to it, but I know myself, so I'm gonna try and think straight. And I'm gonna start with making it just all thin first. So my thinnest stroke, and then I'm gonna look at it and compare it to my eye. And I don't need as much loop here on the bottom, and I could make it a little thicker. So those two things are what I'm going to change. I'm going to make it a little thicker, and instead of a loop, I'm just going to curve to the side. And what I know about letters is the dot always is in line with the stem. And it looks heavy. So I'm going to do it one more time. And this time I'm going to allow it to float on the baseline. That doesn't look as heavy. Then once I have one that I like, I'm going to mark it. So I'm making specific changes, telling myself what I'm going to try next and why. And if I can do that, I'll be more successful. In this alphabet, the T looks like the second easiest letter. So the T is going to go above the X height, and it has a square top. So I'm gonna, same thickness as the I, and that same gentle exit, and the crossbar is right on the X height, and it is thin, and I maybe made it too wide. So I'm gonna try it again. The only thing I'm gonna change is that crossbar. The next letter I'm going to try is a J. The J, I need to know that my descender is short, and I have this little entrance mark. So first I'm going to try it the way I would write it, with a thin up, and it kind of curves. And it's probably going to be I probably started too wide. and I come down and then curve to the left. And this one does have a little curve and a dot. Then I'm going to try it a different way, where I'm going to do the stem first and then come down with that entrance stroke. And then I'm going to look at it, and I think even though it's going to pain me, I want a little bit more like this line would be a loop if I continued it on the bottom. And I really was more successful pulling that entrance stroke down, so I'm going to keep that. So thick, almost like I'm finishing getting ready for a loop, and then there. And I'll mark it. The L would usually be in this family, but it looks hard. So I'm going to leave it for a minute. And what I'm going to do is jump to the O family. The O is an oval. Remember, I decided it was 1/8 inch wide to 2/8 tall. And it looks like it doesn't quite close at the top, so maybe I'll incorporate that thick to thin. And I think this, doing it completely in an upstroke, makes that line too thin, so I'm going to change that, and I'm going to do it in 2 strokes, so a downstroke and a downstroke. Then I'm going to compare it to my O, and I am going to make it a little bit more boxy, for lack of a better term. And I think that looks more like the O. A little bit boxier. There's a secondary weight. This is on the left is still the thicker stroke, but it's not a complete hairline like that entrance stroke on the J. And then I will do a bunch of these oval letters. So I like this O, so I'll go to a C, which I'll probably do in 2 strokes because it looks like the end of the C has some thickness. So start thin and go to thick. Now it looks too slanty, so what I'm going to change is I'm going to bring this bottom stroke up a little bit. Boxy, come up higher. Now, the thing I notice is this C violates the X height a little bit. So I'm going to try it a little bit taller than my X height and see what happens. And then I will compare it to other letters that I've already decided I like. And I think that there's a reason why it is taller than the X height, so I think I'll keep that. The E, from what I know about pointed pen, is I'm gonna be more successful doing the E in 2 strokes than I am trying to do it like a 3rd grade cursive. So I'm gonna start boxy O shape, and then the bowl, it's bowl heavy. So I'm going to make sure that I hit the stem below my midpoint. And you may think, all of this nitpicky stuff, when am I ever going to do that? When you want to be a really good letterer, that's when you're going to do it. Because this attention to detail and figuring out what makes the letter look good is what makes you a good letterer. Let's do an A next. The A violates that X height like the C does, and it looks like an O. And what I know is my downstroke has to be a downstroke. And maybe I made that a little too wide, so I'll try it again. And that looks too static. So I'm gonna try it again and pretend like I'm making a C and then make an A. So this one I kept the pen in motion and tried to make it 1 stroke, and I didn't like it. This one I made a C and then I made a downstroke, and I like that one better. And if I compare it to my I can start to see the slant of these letters. That's not very much of a slant, but slightly. It looks lively. If I can make an A, I can make a D. So I'm going to pretend like I'm making a C. And then make a D. I remembered that my ascenders are taller than my descenders. So I started in the space above. And a G. There's a little bit of grace to that downstroke on the G. So I'm going to think about that while I come down. So I'm going to start in grace, and my descenders are short. And what I know about descenders is I want the majority of my weight of the line to be in the X height. So I'm going to let up pressure, and this is really a hairline at the bottom. And I'm going to compare it. And on the exemplar, it looks like the curve extends slightly further than the oval. And I can check that by lining up the line. And it doesn't really, but see how that stem pulls to the right away from the slant a little bit? That's why it gives us that counter space. It looks like the counter space is larger down there because this line pulls just a bit. So pull. And that's my favorite one, so I'll mark it. Okay, I'm going to switch to another family, this N family with this baseline branch. So my stroke and this baseline branch. And what I was doing was, I was thinking of a snake. And this time I won't think of a snake. I'll think of a downstroke and then a hairline up and a thick down and up.
Try it again. That's what it looks like.
So
More pointed.
now I know I can't think about a snake here. I have to think about two separate strokes, even if it's just a pause. The M is much the same. There's a little bit of ignoring the baseline going on. And I may have, instead of going large to small, I have to think about the X height while ignoring the baseline. And that will give me a better letter. And I'm gonna do it and make one more time and make it a little bit narrower. And I think the narrow is the best. The H, the ascender is a little bit taller. I'm going to go to the baseline and then I'm going to think of that branch from the baseline. Now this time, the first time I just plopped my pen, made a mark, and I didn't consider that entrance stroke. The second time I did it, I tried to be more careful about squaring my top, and it gave me a prettier line. So now I know I have to be more aware of the beginning of my stroke, and I'll like it better. Okay, I think I'm ready to try the L. The L, I could try starting at this midpoint of the X height and loop up and then down and out. I could try that. That gives me something. I could try the main stroke first and then looping the second letter. That gives me more control of the counter shape here. So I will probably do that. And I think I need to make that counter shape a little bit narrower. So these little teeny adjustments are what make your letters prettier while you're practicing. So I've tried enough of the letters and have enough idea of what's going on with the families to now try and write the whole alphabet. So always referring back to my exemplar, I'm going to write the alphabet. And I decided I needed a boxy C and 2 strokes. The D doesn't have that exaggerated branch. The E, a boxy C, and a big bowl. The F we haven't done, so I'm going to do my ascender, line down. There's some grace down here, and it comes all the way back up to my X height for that curve. And so pushing the pen on a thin, all that whole length, I wasn't very successful. So I'll do the F again, but I'll do it in 2 strokes, 3 strokes. And I have to do it one more time because I noticed that this loop doesn't end at the X height, it ends at the midpoint. So I have to do F, and I'm going to start here at the midpoint and whoop, loop up and down. And this is the F that I want. So just for good measure, I'll do the E again and the F. And I need I didn't do that right. And it's okay. It's just paper. That was better. Then I'll go to the G. And remember, I decided the counter space and look what I discovered when I did the G. I was making too much. I was giving the descender on the F too much space. So let's try it with just, there we go. So I'm gonna give myself a reminder that I needed to make that descender short. The H is tall and it has the baseline branch. The I is a welcome relief. The J, remember, I wanted to come down for that entrance stroke because I had more control that way. We haven't done a K yet, but I know that it's going to be a downstroke and a baseline branch and a nice round big upper bowl. Like the E. And then we have the L, which I decided I wanted to do in 2 strokes, so I'd have more control. And M. The N gives me an opportunity to fix what I did wrong in the M. The O, I decided I would do it in 2 strokes. You don't have to if you can do it in 1 stroke. The P violates the X height. And it's a short descender. And it doesn't have a baseline branch. And the Q. I got too slanty on that downstroke. So what I will do is I'll do a P again, and then I'll do a Q, and I will think of that P slant. The R violates the X height. I know I could probably do thin up, and it looks like a little loop, and then thick down. I could do it in 1 stroke. But from what I know about the J entrance stroke, I could also do it. I didn't like that. So I'm going to go thin up. And from what I know about letters is the curve here is probably close to the curve here on the O. Just historically, I know that. So I will, instead of making a straight line there, I'll think of the bottom of an O. Now we got to S. And what we know about the S is historically it fits in an O. And this is a well-designed font, so they're probably paying attention to some of those rules. So I'm going to give myself an O and try to see what happens if I follow that. What I know is these bowls on the top of the K and the E are bigger, so I'm going to have more counter space on the top than on the bottom. And it's going to fit in an O. And I want my thick. That was a little less sign paintery. But maybe I like the sign paintery S. But I did take what I knew from the C and I did this pull down in this direction instead of trying to start with my pen there and move up. The T, when I pay attention to the beginning of my stroke, I get a better line. And I want to add the X height and narrow. Ooh. My U has the D branch, so it's not. I think my exit strokes are a little too curvy if I was going to mimic exactly. It would be not a curve up, it would be an exit out and then stop. And so I have to decide, is that something I want to change about my hand, the way my hand is working, or is that going to be how I do it? So if I was being more exact to the exemplar, that would probably be a better exit stroke than this one. And so I can decide, my hand wants to do this. I don't hate the way it looks, so I'm going to do it that way. Or I want to be aware of it and do it the way the exemplar does it every time. The V has this extended thin stroke. I know pushing my pen against the paper that long in a thin isn't going to be very successful, so I'm going to do the V in 2 strokes. It has not a point, but a boxy bottom, V. And my W, I'm going to try and do that, and then the last stroke, I'm going to start above the X height and meet. But I'm being careful not to add any much pressure to that. The X, like the E and the K and the S, has more counter space on the top of the letter than the bottom. And it looks like it's a thick and then a thin. And the Y has that G downstroke. Now the Z, I'm going to have to look at this Z very carefully because usually our letters will cross at the base, at or below the baseline, but this loop is going to cross and come out at the midpoint of the X height. So I'm going to have to make with a pencil, because this is gonna trick my brain. I want thin to thick to midpoint, right? Then I'm gonna come up, go down, short descender. That's the basic shape of the Z. And there are some little tricks. This looks like it goes straight down like that instead of it's not like a curve, it's this. So can I make my pen do this in one direction? Kinda. So what if I start with this first part? And if I look closely at the exemplar, the weight seems to be at the X height and not here at the side. So in order to do that, I probably need to turn my paper or my pen so I can do weight there and then turn my pen again. That looks more like what I want. So now that we've done the whole alphabet, analyzed it, we have a decision to make. We can start writing words with these lowercase letters to really cement the lowercase letters into our hand, or we can go to the capital letters. So what I want us to do is write a few words first before we go to the capital letters. The first word, let's write aspire. So A S P And then we have the R, which comes up. And an E. Then I would look at it and I would make some decisions about how these letters are working together. Did I leave enough space between the P and the I? No, I didn't. That's usually my problem, is I usually put my letters too close together. And just by being a little bit more aware of my spacing, I got a better word. Let's write believe. So I want it just taller. Baseline branch. Now the L, I want that loop there. Now let's challenge ourselves and write congratulations. It's really awkward to do this L in 2 strokes, but I get a better L that way. Whoop. So now the question is, this is literally a font. Why would I go to the trouble of figuring out how to make these letters by hand when I could literally just type it out? And the answer is because you learn a lot doing this. Okay, Jane wants to see a Z again. So what I'm gonna do is write fuzz because also the F, I want to do F again. So I have this to here, the U, which doesn't have the ridiculous branch. Now, remember I had to turn my pen a little bit or my paper so I could adjust where the thickness was. And thick. And then turn it back. Come up. Short descender, loop in the midpoint. Turn my paper and my pen so I can change where my thickness hits. Whoop. And if I decide I hate that Z, I like this one. This one I like. I lost the boat there. I can change it following some of the rules that I know make sense in the alphabet. Whoop, I forgot which R I was doing. So this is changing the E away from what the font did, but what would be more comfortable in my hand. And then because you are doing it by hand, instead of doing an F and an R, you can start to use what you know about ligatures in other alphabets. Okay, so we've hit noon. Do you want to ask questions while you stand and roll your shoulders? And then we'll have a short break. And then when you're ready, the next thing is to either do these steps for the capital letters of the same font, or you can choose one of these other fonts to try and figure out. Same steps that we did before. So, questions first.
Don't forget to unmute yourself.
Mike Kegsig did not create this font, but he sent it with his handouts. And it was one of the fonts we were given to analyze and try and figure out if we could do it with our pen. So he suggested this font. The Mistral font was suggested by Mike Keksig, but also Carl Roars loves this font and has a brush lettering style that he does based on this font. Okay, so 5-minute break, come back at noon, and we'll work together. The way we'll work it is you can unmute, and whatever you're working on, you can interrupt the group with questions. If you hate that idea, you can work on your own privately. But I think we learn a lot from the questions that we run into while we're trying to analyze something on our own. So be back at noon, and we'll start the next half where you get to do it by yourself. Here's another example of Mike Keksig work. It's with a pointed pen, but it's the foundational, and this one. And once you, part of the reason why I like him as a calligrapher is he doesn't get pigeonholed into one thing. Yes, he's pointed pen, but he uses the pointed pen in so many different ways that there's no limit to what he can do with it. So now your options are figure out the capitals to the same font, or choose one of the other fonts to analyze and then try to work out with your pen. The reason why we start with the minuscule letters is because That's what we use the most of. If you're writing something, there's one capital, two capitals, and how many minuscules. So that's why we start with the minuscules. And the minuscules have the rules, there's less rules and variations to the rules in minuscules than there are in capitals. You could try this lady script font. This one won't be exactly 1/4 of an inch. This one I tried to make sure that when I was laying it out, that it would be about 1/4 of an inch. And the cool thing about the Mistral font is they do connect, but it's a font and the connections work, and that is rare in fonts. That's why I think so many calligraphers love this font, because it actually works. Okay, so my job now is to answer questions that you run into while you work. So start with the baseline, and then the X height, and then the ascender and descender, and slant, and then it goes into the shape and form of the letters, the questions for those. So when you run into a question, feel free to type it in the chat or unmute and ask it. I think the setting right now is if you press the space bar and hold it, it should unmute you while you're asking your question. But they've changed Zoom in the last 3 months.
Hi, I just came back and I don't have sound. Is there a reason why?
Oh, I think, are we being quiet right now? Can you hear us now, Lily?
Yes, I hear you now.
Yes, there won't be much talking because I want you to feel like you won't interrupt me. So while you're analyzing your own thing, either a capital or a different font of the minuscules, I want you to analyze it and stop if you have a question and ask the question so that we can learn together while working independently.
So Brecken,
Yeah.
when you're trying to do the baseline and that, on the uppercase letters, I mean, they're all over the place. So is it better to go with the one that's higher or the one that's lower on the A through M?
That is a great question. Which font are you working on, Robin?
The same one, the Murray Hill that we,
Okay.
just uppercase for it.
So the question is, there is variation in the baseline. And what I usually do is try to get most of them lined up and then split the difference on the other ones. So if I was looking at just that A, because the G floats, the second stroke of the H floats. So the majority, you want the majority to, you want to line up your baseline with the majority of the strokes and split the difference on the ones. So like there's some space here on that second stroke of the A, but if I look at it, it happens on the H and the K and the M. So that must be a characteristic of the letters.
Okay, thanks.
And there's a little bit of experimenting that has to go on. But that's why I did long lines instead of just individual letters, because the individual letters would all have a different baseline if we did it each letter individually. And when I would do the capital line, I would probably turn my paper and do it this way, just because then I could see more of the letter. But there are people who do it this way and cover up the letter with the ruler and just do it until they only see a few points sticking up. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so you don't correlate the lowercase x height with the upper at all?
Nope, they are different. They're different heights. Just like in calligraphy, where italic has a capital height of 7 and an X height of 4 pen widths. So the capital height isn't twice the X height. And some fonts you will find they do twice the X height, but treat them as different families, cousins, but individual families. And there's usually some kind of graphic relationship between the proportions of the X heights. Oh, look at that. It's a 1/2 inch. This tool is invaluable. And Jane introduced it to me. It's an 1/8 inch grid printed on a transparency, but it's much easier to see through than a see-through ruler. And I also think it's more versatile. So if you don't have one, get one. And they're way cheaper than all the other calligraphy tools out there.
So Brecken, so should you draw a midline on the caps or no?
I would just so that I could see where the branches are hitting, where the different bowls are hitting. The more clues you give yourself, the better it will be to analyze. So if I didn't draw the midline, I might think the crossbar and the A is just in the middle. But if I have that line to compare it to, I can say, oh, it's not. It's below the middle. And this horizontal oval that makes the top bowl of the B is almost 2/3 of the thing. And look how far down that C comes, all the way to that midline. So some people are blessed with a really strong eye and they can just look at it and go, oh, this is what I need to do. And others of us need to give ourselves more clues to look at and help analyze.
Great, thanks.
I'm cheating and using a brush pen for these minstrels because I have one and I can try and use it to see what happens. Based on what I know of a brush pen in comparison to a pointed pen.
So Brecken on Murray Hill on the H, that like entrance stroke or the flourish on the top of the H, that would that be a good one to rotate your paper?
That is a good question because, and we can find out the answer based on where the shade is. So the shade runs horizontal, right?
Mhm.
And when we were playing with our pen, I lost the page. When we were playing with our pen, if I kept the pen straight, my thicks were here and here. And when I turned the paper, I had to have the horizontal that way.
Okay.
So the
That's
answer is yes. You
Okay.
probably have to turn your paper. And
That's
then the question is, are you going to turn it this way and do a loop pressure meet, or are you going to turn it this way and do a thin pressure come back up? And you'll have to experiment which gives you the better, more consistent shape. And knowing myself and my abilities, this flourish would probably be the last thing I do. I'd make sure that these counter shapes were right first, and then I would add the flourish.
okay. Thanks.
But then knowing that for the H, it's gonna apply for the F and the K and even the B, right? Because the thick is right here. And it's a little bit easier to do that with a brush pen because you don't have to worry about your tines. But with a pointed pen, you're probably going to have to turn your paper so you can get the thicknesses in the right places.
So on that, would you say the ratio is either 2 to 2? And then on some of them, it's like 2 height and 1.5.
So that's a
across.
good question. um, this one, the O, I just did it, and it was 3 squares wide to 4 squares tall. So in Roman proportions, the O would be a 1 by 1, right? It would be a circle. And so it's still an oval, but it's 3 wide and 4 tall. And so that looks like it's going to carry over to the Q. The base of the Q is 3 squares wide. The G, though, is only 2 squares wide and 4 squares tall. So it's not quite following rules that we know. So this is one where you would probably have to look at each letter and when I'm lining up my grid on a letter, the important parts are the legible part. So what I want to make sure is this part, the V part of the M is what I'm focusing on. And then the flourish, I'm treating it as a flourish. So the M is 1, 2 for the V, 3, and then 2 more for the flourish. Which that's going to be kind of hard to translate. But I know my V of the M is going to be about 2 wide. And then this flourish is going to come out an oval.
Okay, so just don't count the flourishes. Just count kind of the basic letter.
The basic letter is what you want to pay attention to first. The flourish is secondary. And so if I were going to do it in the flourish first way, then I'm going to make sure I have that V is wide enough. And so if I were going to do an A next, the thickest part of the A, if I'm analyzing it, is going to come out and cover 1 square width. And then from that point to the oval part of the flourish is 3. So 1, 2, 3. So the oval part of my flourish is going to hit there. So I would, and then that made it too wide. So I do it again. And I'd use my paper so that the lines are gonna help me. And this time I'm gonna try and go that way. And I was a little bit more successful. And then that crossbar is below center. Even still, I'm leaving too much space in this counter-shaped triangle. So now I'll try it the other way. And this is experimenting with the pen and your hand and the shapes you can make to make something you like.
You're off camera a little bit.
Whoa. Did I unplug? I unplugged my camera. Okay. That is weird. Okay. So what I'm doing is paying attention to the relationship between the letters. I don't know why. It's so blurry. And when I think of make an M, but really I'm making an A, I get that counter shape better. Maybe because I hate turning my paper so much, I would try doing this with a straight pen holder and a pointed nib. Then you don't have to turn your paper as much. Or maybe I don't care that the thick is going to be on the top and I want to just leave it. Yep. Since I'm the boss of what I do on my paper, I probably am going to change where the thick is on those loopy letters so I don't have to turn my paper. Unless you love it on the top. Then with the pointed pen, you get new troubles introduced by pen drags and pulling ink, and new problems to solve. Cool. Okay, you've been working for about an hour. Did any more questions pop up?
Okay, if I draw these out with a pencil first and then write them, is that just training wheels?
I think whatever you do, to help your brain figure out what you need to do, you're allowed to do.
Okay, thank you.
So that's a great tool to draw it with a pencil first. And with the remembrance that a pencil can go in directions that a pen might not be able to go.
Yeah.
Any other observations, things that helped you that I didn't tell everybody that you discovered on your own?
You actually wrote this on your um, notes that you sent to us prior, but using the light table always really helps me to learn that muscle memory. And then I was going to say that I'm not writing it twice, once in pencil, once in pen, but just doing it on the light table the first time is really helpful.
Mhm.
The
So,
other thing is that then I'm not teaching myself wrong strokes in the process.
yeah, so tracing is an important tool. And then the next step would be writing it and then putting your written untraced letter above the exemplar on a light table so you can see what your natural, where you're deviating from the exemplar when you're not tracing it. That's also a helpful tool.
Yeah.
And I didn't demo it because the light pad I have scrolls on Zoom.
Oh,
And so I need to, if you have a light table that doesn't scroll on Zoom, send me the brand name so that I can get one that doesn't drive everyone crazy. But yes, tracing is an important tool. When I teach lettering to sixth graders, I always do a project when my kids are in sixth grade, and I tell them, okay, now we're gonna trace a letter. And they're all like, what? Isn't that cheating? Whatever tool you have to help you visualize and get it in your hand is what you're gonna use. Thank you, Kathy. Any other discoveries you made while you were working?
No, but I just did the light pad too because it was too hard.
I think that it's an important step in learning is the light pad. So no shame.
when I first looked at this, I thought, oh gosh, I think I did this when I was in about 8th grade. This was my natural writing, but it's harder than it looks.
Uh-huh.
If you do it right, it's harder than it looks.
Yeah, there's a lot of nuance to it. And you'll find that with really well designed fonts. Um, there's little teeny nitpicky things that happen across the letters that yes, there's relationships between the letters, but there are little teeny things that they change so that it will look good when it's repeated over and over and over again.
The problem I'm having is not connecting my letters.
Mm-hmm.
It's such, when I make a stroke, I just automatically want to take it right into that R. And trying to leave them separate is hard for me.
Yeah. Well, Jane, you have permission to connect the letters. And just because the font doesn't do it doesn't mean we can't figure out how to do it. But what I would say is when you're deciding to deviate, look for clues within the letters on how that deviation is going to happen. So I would look at branches to see how those connectors would probably work in the alphabet based on what the branches are doing. And then I would do something that looks good to me. And that's what I would stick with. And the Mistral font does connect, and they connect in really interesting ways. And when you do it letter by letter, some of them, the connection is halfway on one letter and the other half on the next letter. And that is what they had to do because of a font. And then how do we, so it looks seamless, the connection of the letters, but then when you look at it, each letter, there's part of the connection of the C, and the A has these little teeny nubs,
Yeah.
but and the O, it's more visible on the O. But because of the way the font works, it has to do that so that it could connect. But we aren't fonts or machines, so we take what we learn from analyzing it and then convert it to our hand or our tool.
So
Usually
the
when
other
you're,
question I have on the Murray Hill maps is I think what Robin was trying to ask. So in looking at it, like on the A, do you put the left side that is the flourish on the line and have the other one top, or do you put the other side on the line and have the flourish drop below?
That is a good question, because then if you look at the B, if you put the baseline on this, on the thick stroke of the A, then the baseline is going to be on the bottom of the thick stroke of the B, but the bowl is going to violate the
Below.
baseline.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So does it really matter which is which?
It matters depending on how your brain works. If your brain can float above a baseline and have those flourishes hit the baseline, then you put it there. If you have to know that my thick strokes end here, then you put the baseline where the thick strokes end. And that's a matter of getting to know yourself and what your tendency is.
And can I just say, I really don't like that crossbar on the H.
You don't have to do it that way.
If we're voting, I'm with you, Jane.
I
Me
just
too.
don't, it's awkward. It's
Uh-huh.
just awkward.
It kind of doesn't go with anything else either.
No. Especially when you have that stick straight crossbar on the A
And the F.
and the
Yeah.
F. Yep. So you don't have to do it. And there's no good way to do it with a pen, because you're either upstroke pushing against, it's uncomfortable.
you know, it's funny is when you've got fonts that look like they're trying to be handwritten, and then we're writing them, trying to make them look like fonts. It's like, okay, stick
So
before the,
true.
you know, the cart before the horse or what.
Which
It's,
came first, the chicken or the egg?
yeah, it just seems funny. It's like, wait a minute, if those are entrance strokes, I can leave them off because I don't need them.
Yep.
That's what's funny when people make their own things and send them in and they've typed them. And it's like, and if I clean those off, they're like, oh, that looks so much better. It's like, well, yeah, it was because it was there to connect something that wasn't there. But it's funny.
Yep. So, so if you like this, it's one of the days of the Mike Keksick 2-day contemporary pointed pen class. The other day is he goes through his pointed pen uncial, pointed pen black letter, the progression of his script and changing the volume of the flourishes. And then half of one of the days is spent studying pinstriping, which is like the brush lines and flourishes done on fancy cars and motorcycles, and doing that with a pen. So I really enjoyed the class. I think it was helpful for me to say, oh, I don't have to just do engrossers with a pointed pen. I can look at all of these other things that I could do with the pointed pen. And then I took a brush lettering class from Carl Roars, and he did almost the same thing with fonts and other people's lettering, where he was like, okay, this was done with a broad edge pen. How do we do it with a brush? And to translate one tool into a different tool really helps you get to know your tools better. And it's a good exercise to figure out what you can do and what you need to find the right tool to do with. I love the Murray Hill with a brush pen, especially for addressing envelopes with a brush pen, because it's extremely legible. It's easy and quick to do with a brush pen. The shapes make sense to me and my hand. Okay, now the real question is, would you do it again on your own?
I think it's so helpful to break it down with the lines so that you can see, where, especially like on the caps, so you can see where, that crossbar on the A is below the midpoint and the B goes below the midpoint. And, it just helps me to, whether I'm using the clear ruler or that clear grid or ruler lines, it helps me to see the relationship of what the letters are doing.
Yeah, I
But
love
I
that
agree,
you
it's
showed us.
easier to brush. Sorry.
I love that you showed us how to break it down and analyze it, because I don't think I've ever gone through that like that. So I appreciate that.
And then once you know how to do that, when you see something you love, you make a copy of it and you mark up your copy and analyze it, and then you have a new thing in your tool belt that you love because you liked the way it looked. And it's a good way to learn the historic calligraphic hands as well as contemporary. Then you're not limited to, well, I've only had a class on this one thing.
I thought it might be helpful to
print it on grid paper.
That's a good
You know
idea.
what I'm saying? How you were kind of drawing it, and it's easy to see it.
Provided it lines up well.
Yeah. And if you're a whiz with Illustrator or Photoshop, sometimes you can scan it and then impose grid lines on there so that when you print it, you did the work previously. But some of us, it takes longer to learn those programs than to just rip out a ruler. Okay.
Okay, so
Well,
I have played with the joining of the letters and the not joining of the letters. And if you join the letters, I have a tendency to change the letter forms if I'm doing that. So I think if you want to keep it, for me, if I want to keep it pure, I have to remember not to join them. They're prettier as they are without joining. And if I start joining, then I change because of habits. I change the shape of the M or the shape of the E or whatever. So that's just a mental note to myself to make sure that I keep them separate.
great. Do you feel like you're a better friend with a pointed nib now that you tried to do it in something other than what we've always done it with? That was a poorly worded question.
I like the practice strokes and the things that we did before we started. That really helped me understand what the nib and the pen can do or can't, or what I can and can't do. That was really, really helpful.
Good, I'm glad. And you can do that with a broad edge pen as well. What if I hold it this way? What if I hold it that way? What if I change the pen angle? So experimenting and making different strokes, but within a pattern to kind of organize your thoughts and processes. I saw, Lily, you pulled out the speedball book. Oh, yep, Lily has the speedball book. I'm gonna ask you to unmute. And spotlight. Here we go.
Can you
So,
see? Or do I pull back? Yep, there.
so that's the newest one, right? And
So
the one on black is the Chicago Fire piece.
right up here.
And it's a beautiful piece of work. And that the red and black slanty with the minuscules and then the unchal, we did that with during the class. He sent that as an exemplar and we tried each of the minuscule styles.
Wow.
So you already have, if you have that speedball book, you already have something to work off of.
It looks
We
like
came
several
here
of
once
his
for
had.
a workshop.
Yeah, that would be good. It looked like several of his had like an extreme baseline slant, like 45-degree angle. That was interesting because there are several that you showed, and then that one also. Those
Yeah.
are nice. So he still does do Zoom classes. He
He
just doesn't
does.
do in person.
Yeah, he doesn't travel,
Mhm.
but he was teaching Zoom classes.
On the stuff that you sent us, this page that is your writing, I don't know if
Uh-huh.
you can see that. Did you do that with a pointed pen or did you do it with a brush?
It's a brush marker. It's the Le Pen Flex.
Ah, okay. Because it's lovely.
Yeah. Oh, I was
You'll notice that there are some things that I changed from the original. I still kept that stupid age, but there were things I didn't notice when I was analyzing it with a brush pen that then I noticed later. But
what were those fine line colored pencils that you were talking about?
they are Pilot Color ENO. And I ordered mine from Jet Pens. I think there's 8 colors in all. And they work on black paper. There's not a white, but there is a bright yellow. And then they have the refills that come. And sharpening pencils is the bane of my existence. So I really love these now that I have them. Especially sharpening colored pencils. There are certain, I have this one. This one is like specifically designed for colored pencil sharpening. And
Scroll up a bit.
sorry, what?
I just couldn't see it.
I think it was this. It's a Uniball. If you search on Jet Pens colored pencil sharpener, then I think 4 show up. And so I got this, but still, I couldn't make sharpening colored pencils my joy. So,
Oh. What eraser works good with black paper?
you know what's funny? The Factus black eraser. It's black. And I don't know who told me that. Somebody told me if your paper's black, use a black eraser. And so I started doing it. And these supposedly are erasable. They're not really erasable. They erase a little bit, but you'd probably have to scrape the black paper to really get them to come off. But a black eraser on black paper and this Fons and Porter white, I never have any residue. I don't know where my
I was using the Funds and Porter. I got one of those at their sale at Joann's, but then erasing it with just a regular kneaded eraser didn't work very good. So that's why I was wondering. So a black eraser that
I
Factus
have
black.
the brand is, I'm pretty sure it's Factus. It's in a box. Yeah. Yeah, it's a black eraser, and I don't remember who told me to try that, but somebody told me and it works great.
It might have been Reggie.
Yeah, I was thinking the same. It
Might
was
have
in a class.
I find this eraser works pretty well for those mechanical colored pencils.
It's the Pentel.
Yeah, the click eraser.
But I have found that the mono eraser is too rough on the black paper. These guys, the Tombow mono eraser.
Yeah.
The eraser actually leaves a mark instead of just taking up what I'm trying to get off.
Oh, that does work good using a brush pen.
Yeah.
Thank you. I found out if I draw my lines a 1/4 inch and then a dotted line and then a solid line 1/4 inch and then 1/8 inch with the dotted line and then 1/8 inch with the solid. I look like I'm on the primers, you know? It works so good because then my dotted lines are my X height and my like descenders for the uppercase.
And that's one thing is determining that interlinear space.
Mhm.
When you're using a font to try and determine the interlinear space, you have to go into your formatting and just make sure it's set at 0. And then that will give you the least amount of space you should have between the baseline and the next X height. Usually it's depending on your program, it's automatically set to have some extra space in between your lines. And when you're determining interlinear space, so that space that the descender is going to be in it and then the ascender of the next line, if you're using short lines, you can have extra space. If your text lines are longer, is that right? If your text lines are longer, then you don't want ridiculous amounts of extra interlinear space. I might have that confused. It's written down in Sheila's book in a section about interlinear space, where the interlinear space, if you're going to change how much space it is, it's determined based on how long your text line is.
Oh.
And it might be short lines close together and long lines farther apart. That might be what it is, but you'll have to reread the book. Okay. For those of you who are watching the recordings, feel free to send questions in and work it. I'm gonna stop the recording now, and so I can show some stuff that doesn't need to be in the recording.